She was only 26, but already magistrates had called Joan Harrison a complete wreck of a human being. She was an alcoholic who mixed with down and outs, and on a winter night in 1975, Joan was brutally murdered. Her killer was never found. The identity of the man known as a hoaxer is another mystery. He sent letters and a tape to detectives hunting the notorious Yorkshire Ripper and derailed Britain's biggest ever murder inquiry. The Ripper was eventually caught and is in Broadmoor Hospital for killing 13 women. But the hoaxer, like Joan Harrison's murderer, has never been traced. Two unsolved crimes, both committed more than 20 years ago. But could the person who battered Joan Harrison to death also be the hoaxer? This man wants to solve the two mysteries that won't go away. He's been hunting the hoaxer, and he's found fresh information that's put police under pressure to reopen both the Harrison and the hoaxer inquiries. Joan Harrison's tough life was etched in her face. Almost everything had gone wrong for her. On good days, she'd put in a few hours unpaid work in a hostel for the homeless. Then she'd head for Preston's town centre pubs, where she was a regular who still remembered.
She was quite a pleasant person. Sometimes she appeared to be a little bit disheveled. She wanted a good sprucing up, but she was a pleasant person, and I never, ever saw her propositioning men. She didn't have any convictions for prostitution. She didn't have any police cautions for prostitution. And I think people have come to the wrong conclusion. She seemed a little bit lonely and a bit sad at times. Didn't see her smile much.
What little luck she had was running out. Joan Harrison was on the way down, separated from her husband, her two children living elsewhere, while she rented a cheap room. Her days and nights passed in an alcoholic haze as she hung out with the destitute or drank alone. She was destined for a life of obscurity, but her death changed all that. She was murdered violently in a backstreet lock-up garage. Her killer had had sex with her, then battered her in a savage attack with a blunt weapon. He'd bitten her breast, and the marks showed he had a gap between his front teeth. Crucially, forensic evidence showed the culprit was of a rare blood group. He was a B secretor. Another woman died violently weeks later, one of a series of killings that went on for 5 years. Women throughout the north were terrified as the serial killer eluded police to attack first prostitutes, then indiscriminately mothers, working women, teenagers.
Well, I think it's about time he was caught. It's very, worrying for all the women that live here. I think it's terrible. They're a bit frightened to go out. I should think it would be at night.
He left little forensic evidence in his perverted slaughter. He roamed back streets, leaving his victims in solitary places from Leeds to Bradford to Manchester. George Oldfield, Assistant Chief Constable of West Yorkshire Police, was in charge of the investigation.
We're doing our best. We want him as much as you do. More so.
With entire communities living in fear, police were under tremendous pressure. They were desperate for a new lead. In 1978 and 79, 3 letters arrived, postmarked Sunderland, from someone calling himself Jack the Ripper. Until then, the police hadn't been sure the Ripper was to blame for Joan Harrison's death. But in 2 of the letters, he claimed responsibility for it. He also gave inside information about another victim. And there was important forensic evidence. Whoever licked the envelopes shared the same rare blood group as Joan Harrison's murderer. He too was a B secretor. A 4th letter arrived with a tape-recorded message.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, the only time they came near catching me was a few months back in Chapel Town when I was disturbed. Even then it was a uniformed copper
Experts called in to identify the distinctive voice agreed it was a Wearside accent, specifically Castletown in North Sunderland. As far as George Oldfield was concerned, the voice of the man who signed himself Jack the Ripper probably was the Ripper, and Joan Harrison was among his first victims.
Before, we know we've been looking for a man, and there are literally millions, and we didn't know where he came from. But now that we can localise the area, the field is not appreciably, as I'm sure you must agree.
Almost overnight, the investigation switched from West Yorkshire to Sunderland. It was one of the worst blunders of modern policing. A local operations centre was set up, along with a Ripper hotline. It was inundated with calls from people who thought they recognised the voice. Thousands of men with Sunderland or Geordie accents were interviewed and samples of handwriting and saliva taken.
To Broadmoor, is it? My name's Clark. I'm a police officer with the Sunderland Police.
I'm not quite
For a while, the tape was played on the hour, every hour on the streets of Castletown. It was heard in pubs and clubs. It was broadcast on radio and television until it seemed no one in the country could have failed to hear what George Oldfield thought was the voice of a killer.
See you soon. Bye.
Police were swamped with information. These were pre-computer days, and they lost control of the paperwork and index cards. But as they scoured the streets of Wearside, 3 more women died elsewhere. Gradually, doubts were raised about whether the voice that was the most infamous in Britain really was the Ripper. Olive Smelt was a Ripper survivor.
I said all along, he's not a Geordie. The man who spoke to me was a Yorkshireman. They really believed he was a Geordie. And I said, when you meet this man, if it's him who spoke to me, you will get a shock.
When Peter Sutcliffe was arrested, it was clear that the police had been completely wrong. They were victims of a dreadful hoax, which the serial killer called divine intervention. Sutcliffe came from Bradford. He'd written no letters and sent no tape recording. £1 million had been wasted publicising the tape and letters. But the immeasurably higher cost was the lives of the 3 women murdered while police hunted the hoaxer. The last victim was a student, Jacqueline Hill.
That man has a lot to answer for. He's obviously got quite a few deaths on his conscience for the rest of his life.
Do you believe that if he hadn't sent that tape and hadn't made those letters, Jacqueline could be alive today?
I'm sure of it. Definitely.
At Peter Sutcliffe's trial in the Old Bailey, he admitted killing 13 women. But there's one murder he's always denied, that of Joan Harrison. The files on the hoaxer and Joan Harrison have never been closed. But 20 years on, Patrick Lavelle, an investigative journalist on the Sunderland Echo, is pursuing both cases. What he needed to help solve them was fresh evidence that could be tested with the latest scientific methods. In June 1999, on the 20th anniversary of the release of the hoaxer tape, Patrick Lavelle published a book about the hoaxer, and a television documentary was transmitted across the north of England. It prompted viewers to offer new information about who the hoaxer might be.
As a result of the programme, more information came in as to the possible identity of the hoaxer. In all, about 50 people called, and 25 suggested names. We looked at this information and listed it all and sent it off to police.
Our hoaxer profile was drawn up by looking at the content of the letters and tapes and forensic evidence, including some found at the scene of Joan Harrison's murder. There was his handwriting, his voice. He was a bee secretor. Oil on the letters suggested engineering connections. His letters, which talk about the killing in Preston, graphically described his loathing of prostitutes. Dr. Carl Roberts is a criminal profiler who drew his own conclusions from all the information.
The overriding impression you get of this individual is somebody who really is looking for some kind of attention, and somebody who's really looking for issues of control and power, somebody who really has a need for these things. There's a real sense of somebody who has a vastly inflated ego, someone who really thinks that they are sort of very clever, very intelligent, much better than the rest. I mean, frequently is derogatory to other people on the inquiry, towards prostitutes. Yeah, it's an interesting pattern. Certainly you've got 2 letters within a week of each other, And then, you know, literally a 12-month gap where, from our perspective, there must be something that's happening in that time. You know, why doesn't he contact? Why doesn't he maintain this contact? We can speculate perhaps he was not in a position to write any more letters, prison perhaps, out of the country perhaps. You know, we certainly don't know what he was doing at that time.
But writing hoax letters is one thing, murder is another. How realistic is it to think one man could have done both?
It's possible that this hoaxer could, in fact, himself have been a killer at some point. Certainly, he has a psychology characteristics that are consistent with individuals that have committed very violent offences, particularly this view almost of self-importance, this anger that he seems to carry with him. That kind of mixture.
We looked at the information ourselves and basically whittled down the 25 names to 5 potential suspects who we thought had quite a few characteristics similar to the profile of the hoaxer. After that, we then had the task, because the police seemed disinterested, of tracking down these 5 men. And we were able to ascertain that 4 of them are still living. One of them we haven't been able to track down.
Of the 4 suspects traced, one had already been reported to the police. In 1987, an off-duty policeman was tipped off about who the hoaxer might be. He sent a detailed report to his superior officer. He expected CID to at least interview the man and get saliva and handwriting samples. But later he heard the report had been thrown away.
The man was in fact married to a prostitute. We checked this out with local people, and that his wife had died at a young age. And it turns out that he did have, through information we obtained from a marriage certificate, links with Bradford through his employment history and also engineering. But one of the most important things we were told by an informant who was very well known to this man's former wife is that he once confessed to her that he had killed a woman. Now obviously this is something that we couldn't check out. It was something that was needed to be checked out by the police.
In 1999, it was reported that police in Preston had a DNA profile of Joan Harrison's killer. If saliva samples could be obtained from any of our suspects, they too could be tested and profiles compared, if only to eliminate the men as suspects. With dogged determination and persistence, Patrick Lavelle managed to get 2 of them to address and lick envelopes without them realising why. Informed speculation was yielding hard new evidence to test scientifically.
I came here to Preston with the names of 5 potential suspects, along with 2 envelopes. 2 of them men had sealed with their own saliva, which is just what the hoaxer did 20 odd years ago. After I handed the information and the material over to the CID in Preston, there was a period where there seemed to be nothing happening. The police seemed disinterested in the information we'd given them and the material we'd given them. In fact, to an extent that a senior officer at Preston, I was told, said he did not want the media setting the agenda. I found that incredible after we'd gone to the extent of getting this information in the first place, particularly the envelopes, and travelling here and handing them over.
An ally was found in the House of Lords, the Home Secretary's advisor on policing, Lord Brian Mackenzie. He was a policeman for 35 years and former president of the Police Superintendents Association.
I can understand their reluctance to go down the path of reopening the whole hoaxer inquiry, simply because it would require a lot of resources. And of course it is a very old crime. That was the hoaxer. But once we start talking about an undetected murder, as you know, an undetected murder never remains a closed file, and therefore I thought this was the key to getting the police to take some action. I wrote to Pauline Clare, the Chief Constable of Lancashire, telling her what my interest was, simply from a professional point of view, and also as a member of the House of Lords, and still interested, obviously, in detecting crime. The Harrison murder is still undetected, and I felt it was worth at least applying a few resources to check the evidence that had been unearthed by obviously yourselves and Patrick Lavelle. It's very real progress, and there's a lot of good work, I think, being done, certainly worth in further investigation.
That was 4 months ago when we handed the material over. I've now been told that a team of 3 detectives is carrying out an internal review of all the evidence, including the evidence we've provided. Then a decision will have to be made about whether they fully and formally reopen the inquiry, not just into the murder of Mrs. Harrison, but obviously the inquiry into the hoaxer.
But the man who most closely fits the hoaxer's profile, the prime suspect, has been elusive. Now we've discovered another important lead. While police from West Yorkshire and Northumbria were scouring the streets of Sunderland looking for the hoaxer, thousands of servicemen were with British regiments abroad. But some of them are believed to have been on army exercises near Preston in 1975, around the time when Joan Harrison died. Then they were posted overseas. It was a forces broadcast of the hoaxer's voice that riveted a squadron sergeant major and brought one particular soldier to mind.
Sometime this year, maybe
I sat back and listened to it and listened to the voice, took it in. Yeah, I agreed with him wholeheartedly. It was the voice.
Squadron Sergeant Major Jeff Lynch, like everyone else at the time, thought this was the voice of the Ripper. No one knew it was a hoaxer's voice. He was ordered to gather information about the soldier. The implications were enormous.
There were a number of things that were fitting together. There was the strong Geordie accent with a lisp. There was the height, the stocky build, the access to engineering tools. There was the left-handedness of the guy, the strength of the guy, and also his blood group. Now, the blood group, I can't remember exactly what the blood group was, to be honest with you, but I know that the blood group that was published in the newspaper was the blood group that was kept on his medical records and was on his ID card at the time. The Special Investigation Branch of the Royal Military Police, they came in and they suggested that we got some more leave passes out for him, which covered his area, covered his time. And the contemporary of mine who looked at these, he identified or looked at, compared the J in his first name to the J in Jack when it was signed in the local papers, Jack the Ripper, and the two J's were identical. There was no question about that. They were identical. We had done several searches within his workspace. Soldiers in a workplace like that have a rag bin. And in this rag bin, which is unusual, in fact, I would say unheard of, in his bin was women's lingerie, which was very unnerving at the time, especially when we knew what we were trying to look for.
The fact that this man was a soldier could answer some serious questions about the whole inquiry. The hoax letters were posted in the same month, March 1978 and March 1979. Was this man perhaps on annual leave? There's also the question about how he could evade police questioning in what was the biggest manhunt this country has ever seen. Is the answer to that he was abroad at the time?
They eventually charged him with possession of ammunition and weapon parts and for falsifying military documents, and it was left at that. I was later told by the RSM at the time, a good friend of mine, who let me believe that the mainland police had never even been contacted as to this, and never invited to come over to investigate further, which I found incredible when you take into consideration the closeness of all the evidence that we had, the closeness to the descriptions and events that had been taking place in the national newspaper. The closeness really did mean to me
and to other people who were involved in it, that, something should have been investigated on a civilian source, on a civilian net.
A spokesman for the army said as far as they were aware, the SIB was acting on behalf of the police, and if they'd found anything worth reporting to them, they would have done so. Although Lancashire Police may reopen the Harrison hoaxer investigation, the two other forces involved have been cool about the subject. Northumbria Police said they pass all inquiries and information on to West Yorkshire Police. And they said if they receive evidence on which they can act rather than suspicions based on the sound of a voice, then they will take positive action. An appeal from a North East MP has also been rebuffed.
It was not a happy period for the police. I think they will regard it as a substantial embarrassment at the time where they switched the massive resources of the Ripper inquiry into Wearside, spent a lot of time, energy and money while the real Ripper was murdering people around in the UK. And I suspect it's not a period they look back on very fondly, and that could well be a reason why they don't wish to reopen this inquiry. I think it's a mistake, and I think it's wrong for them to take that attitude. I think there is new evidence on the table. That evidence has been made available to the police, and I think there is a legal as well as moral duty on them to act upon it. What I would like to see is West Yorkshire and Northumbria Police Force discuss this matter, look at the evidence which has been made available, new evidence which has come forward, and I think there is a duty on them to reopen the investigation. I don't wish to preempt what that investigation might come up with. That is a matter for the police and the courts, but nevertheless it needs to be looked at, and it's crucial and it's important that this happens.
I'm not quite sure when I'll strike again, but it will be definitely sometime this year.
We were so close, matching the images, and like I say, we were looking for the Ripper. I haven't even thought about the hoaxer, identifying this guy with the hoaxer. But if you're telling me that the voice that we heard on the radio was now not the voice of Jack the Ripper, but the voice of the hoaxer, I'd have to come down on your side and say, I think so.
The police seem disinterested. In fact, it's been a year now since we launched the investigation, and all we've come across in that time is an official wall of indifference. For this investigation to be taken any further, we really need some police action. But the question is, will police act on it? What do they want? Do they want the name, the address of the prime suspect? Do they want a signed photograph and a handwritten confession, and perhaps an invitation? Come and get me.
No good looking for fingerprints. You should know by now. It's plain as a whistle. I can't see myself being nicked just yet. See you soon. Bye.
Anyone with any information about the hoaxer should ring 0191 269 3572. That's 0191 269 3572.